Imagine you are suspended 8 feet in the air, locked inside a reinforced steel fortress weighing 80,000 pounds. You've drawn the blackout curtains, the air brakes are set, and the hum of the world has faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. In this tiny metal sanctuary, you feel untouchable, elevated far above the dangers of the ground. After all, nobody can just look into your window. It's physically impossible for a human being to peer inside without climbing the steps. But tonight, we're gonna learn that some things don't need steps. Tonight's story takes us into the isolated, high-stakes world of long-haul trucking, specifically into the dense, swampy canopy of the East Texas woods. This is the documented account of Valerie, a hardened veteran of the road who feared nothing until she looked through her passenger window and saw something that shattered her reality. It was a creature that stood flat-footed on the asphalt, yet was tall enough to look her directly in the eye. Before we pull back the curtains on this nightmare, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Have you ever seen something in the woods that shouldn't exist? I want to hear your stories. I'm your host, Midnight Rider, and you're listening to Channel 19 Mysteries. Now, let's get into tonight's story. A female trucker's terrifying escape. Tonight's story is going to take us into the incredibly isolated, high-stakes world of long-haul trucking. It is a profession that most of us rely on every single day. Yet we rarely think about the sheer vulnerability of the men and women who drive those massive 18-wheelers through the absolute middle of nowhere, dead in the middle of the night. To a truck driver, their sleeper cab is their entire world. It is their kitchen, their living room, their office, and their sanctuary. It is a tiny, self-contained box of metal, fiberglass, and glass, floating roughly 8 feet above the asphalt. The general feeling among drivers is that once you pull the air brakes, lock the massive doors, and draw the heavy blackout curtains closed, you are safe. You are elevated far above the ground, sealed inside a fortress weighing up to 80,000 pounds. Nobody can just walk up and look into your bedroom window. It is physically impossible for a human being to peer into the side window of a Peterbilt truck without climbing up the metal steps bolted to the fuel tanks. But what happens when the thing that walks up to your truck in the dead of night isn't human at all? What happens when you pull back those curtains, fully expecting to see the empty, dark woods, and instead, you find yourself staring directly into the glowing amber eyes of a monster that is standing flat-footed on the ground, yet tall enough to look down at you? This is the true, documented account of a female truck driver named Valerie, and a night that destroyed her understanding of the natural world. To understand the sheer horror of this event, you first need to understand Valerie. Back in the year 2018, Valerie was not a rookie. She was a hardened, experienced, over-the-road trucker who had been driving heavy machinery since the late 1990s. She had seen it all. She had driven through blinding blizzards in the Rocky Mountains, navigated treacherous black ice in the Dakotas, and dealt with every type of shady character, lot, lizard, and cargo thief you could imagine at dimly lit truck stops across the country. She was a no-nonsense, incredibly tough woman who carried a tire iron behind her seat and kept a massive 110-pound German Shepherd mix named Duke in the cab with her at all times. Duke was fiercely protective. If anyone even walked within 10 feet of the truck while it was parked, Duke would let out a low, vibrating growl that could be felt through the floorboards. Between her own street smarts and Duke's protective instincts, Valerie feared absolutely nothing on the road. But there was one specific region of the country that always gave her a slight sense of unease, and that was the deep, piney woods of East Texas, specifically the desolate stretches near the Sabine River basin. If you were to look at a map of Texas, the eastern border, where it meets Louisiana, is defined by the Sabine River. This area is not the dry, flat desert that most people picture when they think of Texas. Instead, it is a dense, swampy, claustrophobic expanse of thick pine forests, dark bayous, and overgrown brush. The trees grow so close together that they form a canopy, blocking out the moonlight and creating an ocean of absolute pitch black darkness as soon as the sun goes down. It is a place completely untouched by modern civilization in many parts and has a long documented history of bizarre sightings. For decades, locals and hunters have reported seeing massive, bipedal, hairy creatures roaming the river bottoms. But Valerie didn't believe in myths, ghosts, or monsters. She believed in diesel fuel, freight rates, and keeping her rig on schedule. The incident took place on November 17th, 2018. Valerie was hauling a fully loaded, refrigerated trailer, commonly called a reefer, packed with frozen poultry, heading northbound through East Texas. It had been an incredibly grueling week. She had started her journey down in South Texas days prior and was pushing her legal driving limits to the absolute maximum. In the trucking industry, drivers are strictly governed by electronic logging devices, or ELDs. These are digital clocks wired directly into the truck's engine that track every single second a driver is on duty. When your driving hours run out, you must pull over and park for a mandatory 10-hour sleeper berth break. If you continue driving even 1 minute past your allotted time, the device flags you and you risk losing your commercial license, facing massive fines, or getting your company in serious legal trouble. By the time the sun began to set on November 17th, 2018, the weather had taken a turn for the worse. A thick, oppressive blanket of gray clouds had rolled in over the pine canopy, and a cold, biting drizzle began to fall, slicking the roads and reducing visibility. Valerie glanced at her digital dashboard. Her ELD was flashing red. She had exactly 45 minutes of legal driving time left. She picked up her headset and called her dispatcher, a man named Marcus. Marcus was based out of a brightly lit office in the Midwest, hundreds of miles away from the dark, winding rural highway Valerie was currently navigating. She told Marcus that she was running out of hours and needed to find a safe place to shut down for the night. Marcus checked her GPS location and informed her that the nearest major truck stop, a sprawling Love's Travel stop with bright lights, security cameras, and hundreds of parking spaces, was over 60 miles away. Given the slick roads and her heavy load, she would never make it there before her clock ran out. "You're gonna have to find a pull-off, Val," Marcus told her over the crackling headset. "There's an abandoned state way station about 10 miles up the road. It's not on the main highway. You'll have to take a farm-to-market road to access the old frontage route, but it's paved, and it's completely legal for you to park there." Valerie hated parking in desolate, unlit areas. It wasn't the supernatural she was afraid of. It was the very real threat of cargo thieves, who were known to target solitary trucks in the dark, cutting the locks on the trailer doors and stealing the freight while the driver slept. But she had no choice. The digital clock was ticking down, showing only 20 minutes left. She agreed to the plan, disconnected the call, and kept her eyes peeled for the turnoff. A few miles later, her headlights illuminated a rusted, faded sign indicating an old way station. She downshifted, the massive diesel engine roaring as she applied the engine brake, and she guided her 79,000-pound rig off the main road and onto a dark, narrow frontage road bordered on both sides by impenetrable walls of pine trees. After driving for about a mile into the absolute wilderness, the road widened into a large, cracked asphalt lot. In the center of the lot sat a small, decaying concrete building with boarded-up windows, the old way station booth. There were no streetlights, there were no other trucks, there was absolutely nothing but the relentless drizzle of the rain and the towering silhouettes of the forest surrounding the lot. Valerie slowly pulled her massive truck into the darkest corner of the lot, positioning the cab facing the tree line so that if anyone tried to approach from the road, she would be able to see their headlights. She brought the truck to a complete stop, reached over to the dashboard, and pulled the two heavy plastic knobs that engaged the parking brakes for the tractor and the trailer. Hiss. The deafening sound of compressed air releasing filled the cab. She reached up and turned the ignition key backward. The massive diesel engine shuddered, rumbled, and then died. The silence that instantly swallowed the cab was jarring. When you drive for 11 hours straight, the vibration of the road and the roar of the engine become a part of your body. When it suddenly stops, the silence actually rings in your ears. The only sound left was the rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine block, the patter of light rain against the windshield, and the distant, muffled hum of the reefer unit running on the front of her trailer behind the cab to keep the cargo frozen. Valerie let out a long, exhausted sigh. She unbuckled her seatbelt and reached over to pet Duke. The The massive German Shepherd was sitting in the passenger seat, staring intently out the windshield into the dark tree line. "All right, buddy," Valerie whispered, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet cab. "Time for bed." She went through her strict nighttime routine. She checked the locks on both the driver and passenger doors, ensuring the heavy deadbolts were engaged. She reached up and pulled the thick, light-blocking curtains across the expansive windshield and the side windows, completely sealing the cab off from the outside world. Then, she climbed through the narrow opening between the two front seats and moved into the sleeper berth in the back. The sleeper berth of a modern Peterbilt is actually quite comfortable. It features a twin-size mattress, a small television, a microwave, and a control panel for the heating and air conditioning. Valerie turned on the small, dim reading light above her pillow, kicked off her boots, and lay back on the mattress, her muscles aching from holding the heavy steering wheel all day. Duke hopped up onto the end of the bed, circled 3 times, and curled into a tight ball against her legs. Valerie set her alarm, closed her eyes, and tried to let the exhaustion take over. For the first hour, everything was perfectly normal. The rain continued to fall, and the rhythmic sound was almost hypnotic. Valerie drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, the kind of sleep where you are still semi-aware of your surroundings. Sometime around 1 in the morning, Valerie was suddenly jolted awake. She didn't know what had woken her up. The cab was pitch black, save for the tiny green LED lights on the heater control panel. She lay perfectly still, holding her breath, listening intently. The reefer unit on the trailer had cycled off, meaning the area was now cloaked in an eerie, absolute silence. Then, she felt it. Duke, the massive, fearless German Shepherd, was trembling. He wasn't just shivering from the cold. His entire body was violently shaking against her legs. Valerie slowly sat up in the dark, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs. She reached out and placed her hand on Duke's back. He was rigid, his muscles tense like coiled springs. He had his head tucked down between his front paws, and he was letting out a sound Valerie had never ever heard him make before. It wasn't his usual aggressive, territorial growl. It was a high-pitched, pathetic whimper. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated terror. "Duke?" Valerie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "What is it? What's out there?" Duke didn't move. He just pressed himself harder against her legs, whining softly. Valerie's mind began to race. Cargo thieves. It had to be cargo thieves. Someone had seen her pull into the abandoned lot, and they had followed her in. They were probably out back, using bolt cutters on the heavy padlock securing the trailer doors. She quietly reached down to the floor of the sleeper berth and wrapped her fingers around the cold, heavy steel of the tire iron she kept next to the bed. She slowly pushed the blankets off, stood up in the cramped space, and crept toward the front of the cab. She peeked through the small gap in the curtains, separating the sleeper from the front seats. The front of the cab was completely dark, the heavy windshield curtains successfully blocking out any ambient light. She stood there, in the silence, gripping the tire iron, straining her ears to hear the sound of metal cutting metal or the crunch of footsteps on the asphalt outside. Instead, she heard something that made the blood in her veins run completely cold. It was a wet, heavy, sniffing sound. But it wasn't coming from the back of the trailer. It was coming from the front of the truck, right outside the passenger side door. Sniff, sniff, huff. The sound was impossibly loud. It sounded like a massive pair of lungs drawing in deep, aggressive breaths of the wet night air. And it was accompanied by a strange, low, vibrating rumble that felt more like physical pressure in the cab than an actual sound. Valerie froze in place. Her mind desperately tried to rationalize what she was hearing. Maybe a stray dog or a wild hog? East Texas was known for wild hogs. But as she stood there, trying to convince herself it was just an animal foraging for food, the truck suddenly moved. Now, you have to understand the physics of an 18-wheeler. When an 80,000-pound vehicle is parked, with the air brakes locked and the suspension settled, it does not move easily. A grown man can throw his entire body weight against the side of the cab, and the truck will not budge a single inch. But as Valerie stood there holding her breath, the entire cab violently dipped to the right, toward the passenger side. Creak, The heavy-duty leaf springs groaned in protest. Something incredibly massive, something weighing hundreds of pounds, had just stepped onto the lower aluminum fuel tank, step on the passenger side of the truck. Valerie's stomach dropped into her shoes. The lower step is roughly 2 feet off the ground. If a person was standing on that step, they would be trying to climb up to the door handle, attempting to break in. Her protective instincts flared. She wasn't going to let some thief break into her home on wheels. Adrenaline overriding her terror, she tightened her grip on the tire iron, stepped through the curtain into the front cab, and moved swiftly toward the passenger side door. She reached out with her left hand, grabbed the edge of the heavy blackout curtain covering the passenger window, and violently ripped it back, fully expecting to see the face of a man trying to pick the lock. But there was no man. When Valerie yanked the curtain back, her face was only inches away from the glass. And looking back at her, from the other side of the window, was a nightmare pulled straight from the darkest corners of human mythology. Valerie stopped breathing. Her muscles locked instantly into a state of total, inescapable paralysis. She was looking directly into a broad, massively muscled chest and shoulder covered entirely in thick, matted, charcoal gray hair. The hair was wet from the rain, clumped together, and she could see the defined, hulking musculature shifting beneath it. Her brain short-circuited. She was looking out the side window of a Peterbilt. The bottom of that window was nearly 8 feet off the ground. Whatever was standing outside her truck was not standing on the fuel tank steps. The cab had leveled back out. The creature was standing flat-footed on the asphalt, and its chest was at eye level with her. As she stood there, completely frozen, the creature slowly turned its head to look at her. Valerie would later tell investigators that the face she saw etched a permanent scar into her psyche. It did not look like an ape, and it did not look like a man. It looked like a monstrous, prehistoric wolf, but with features that were terrifyingly human-like in their intelligence. It had a long, pronounced snout with leathery, dark gray skin around the lips. Its ears were pointed and stood erect on the top of a massively wide, domed head. But it was the eyes that broke Valerie's sanity. They were huge, deep-set, and glowed with an unnatural, self-illuminating amber light. They were not the mindless, reflective eyes of a deer caught in headlights. They were predatory, hyper-intelligent, and filled with a sinister, calculating awareness. The creature was looking directly into her eyes, studying her, fully aware of the fragile barrier of glass separating them. The creature leaned forward, bringing its horrific face within an inch of the glass. Valerie could see the hot, white steam of its breath exhaling from its nostrils, fogging up the outside of her window. It bared its teeth rows of thick, yellowish, jagged fangs that looked capable of snapping a human femur in half. It let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the glass, through the metal door, and directly into Valerie's chest. The sound was so deep and powerful that the loose change sitting in her cup holder began to rattle. Valerie was trapped. She was standing in the darkness of her cab, less than 2 feet away from a creature that defied all logic, biology, and reason. If it wanted to, it could simply punch its massive clawed hand through the window and pull her out into the night. She couldn't fight it. The tire iron in her hand felt like a child's toy compared to the sheer, overwhelming mass of the beast outside. She knew she had to start the truck and drive away. But the ignition key was on the dashboard, located on the driver's side. To get to it, she would have to turn her back on the creature, move across the cab, and sit in the driver's seat. Furthermore, starting a diesel engine is not a quiet process. It requires turning the key, waiting for the glow plugs to warm up, and then the engine fires up with a deafening, explosive roar. She was terrified that the sudden, aggressive noise of the engine would startle the creature, provoking it into an immediate, violent attack before she could even get the truck in gear. For what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 10 or 15 seconds, Valerie and the monster simply stared at each other. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost with a look of morbid curiosity, as if it was studying a bug trapped in a jar. Then, the creature slowly raised its arm. Valerie watched in absolute horror. as a massive hand, a hand that looked like a grotesque hybrid between a human hand and a wolf's paw, complete with thick, leathery pads and incredibly long, curved black claws pressed flat against the glass of the window. The claws tapped lightly against the pane. Click, click, click. It was testing the glass. That sound broke Valerie's paralysis. Pure, unadulterated survival instinct took over. She dropped the tire iron, threw herself backward across the center console, and scrambled into the driver's seat. She didn't bother putting her seatbelt on. She didn't bother checking her mirrors. She reached out with a trembling, sweat-slicked hand and slammed the key into the ignition. She didn't wait for the glow plugs to warm up. She brutally twisted the key all the way forward. The starter motor whined loudly for a terrifying, agonizing second, and then the massive diesel engine detonated to life with a deafening roar. At the same moment, Valerie slammed her palm down on the 2 air brake valves on the dashboard, pushing them in to release the brakes. The violent purge of the air dryer exploded from underneath the truck, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet night. Valerie risked a single, split-second glance toward the passenger window. The sudden, explosive noise of the engine and the air brakes had startled the creature. It had dropped down from the window, disappearing from view, moving incredibly fast toward the front of the truck. Valerie didn't wait to see where it went. She grabbed the heavy gear shifter, slammed it into drive, grinding the gears violently in her panic, and stomped her foot down on the accelerator as hard as she physically could. The 79,000-pound truck lurched forward, the heavy rear tires spinning and throwing wet gravel and mud into the air as they struggled to find traction on the slick, decaying asphalt of the abandoned lot. The truck violently bounced over the deep potholes, shaking the entire cab. But Valerie didn't care. She kept the accelerator pinned to the floorboards. She tore out of the lot and swung the massive rig onto the dark farm-to-market road, taking the turn so fast that the trailer tires lifted entirely off the ground on one side, nearly rolling the entire vehicle into the deep ditch. The truck slammed back down onto all 18 wheels with a bone-jarring crash, and Valerie kept accelerating, flying down the narrow, unlit road at nearly 70 miles an hour, a suicidal speed for a loaded semi on a wet, rural highway. She stared desperately into her side mirrors, terrified that she would see the massive, horrifying silhouette of the creature sprinting out of the tree line, chasing her down. But the road behind her remained empty, illuminated only by the faint red glow of her trailer's taillights reflecting off the wet pavement. Valerie didn't take her foot off the accelerator until she merged back onto the main interstate. She drove for nearly 2 solid hours, completely ignoring her flashing ELD that was loudly warning her she violated federal driving laws. She didn't care if she got a ticket. She didn't care if she lost her job. She just wanted to be surrounded by light and other human beings. Around 3 a.m, Valerie finally pulled into a sprawling, brightly lit Pilot Flying J truck stop on the outskirts of Dallas. The parking lot was packed with hundreds of other trucks, and the bright, artificial canopy lights illuminated the entire area like it was high noon. She pulled into a parking space right next to the front doors of the building, shoved the air brake valves out to lock the brakes, and turned the engine off. It was only then, sitting under the safety of the glaring fluorescent lights, that the adrenaline finally left her body. The shock set in, and Valerie collapsed over the steering wheel, sobbing uncontrollably. Duke, who had remained hidden under the bunk for the entire chaotic escape, finally crawled out, hopped into the front seat, and began licking the tears off her face, whimpering softly. Valerie sat in the cab for over an hour before she finally mustered the courage to pick up her phone and call her dispatcher, Marcus. When Marcus answered, sounding groggy and confused at the early hour, Valerie didn't tell him about the wolf-faced monster with amber eyes. She knew exactly how that would sound. She knew that in the heavily regulated, highly scrutinized world of commercial trucking, a driver reporting a werewolf attack would be immediately subjected to random drug tests, psychological evaluations, and likely fired on the spot. Instead, her voice shaking, she told Marcus a half-truth. "Marcus," she stammered, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. "I was attacked. I was parked at that abandoned way station you told me about, and someone some men. They tried to break into the cab. They climbed right up the side of the truck and tried to smash the window. I had to flee. I drove over my hours. I'm sorry. Marcus was immediately sympathetic, telling her not to worry about the ELD violation, assuring her that her safety was the only thing that mattered, and offering to call the highway patrol to file a report about the attempted break-in. Valerie adamantly refused the police report, claiming it was too dark to get a description, and she just wanted to move on. She hung up the phone, completely exhausted, completely traumatized, and fully aware that she would carry the true horror of that night to her grave. Valerie continued driving a truck for several more years before eventually retiring. But after the events of November 17th, 2018, her entire approach to her job changed. She absolutely refused to take any dispatch that routed her through the Sabine River basin. She never again parked at an unlit rest area, an abandoned lot, or the side of an empty highway. If her hours were running low, she would park hours early just to ensure she had a spot under the brightest lights at the busiest truck stop she could find. Because Valerie knew the terrifying truth. She knew that the world is much older, much darker, and much more wild than we pretend it is. She knew that the glass and metal of an 18-wheeler was nothing but an illusion of safety. And she knew that out there, hidden in the pitch-black canopy of the deep woods, some things view us not as the apex predators of this planet, but merely as prey locked inside a vending machine. Well, that is a truly chilling thought to leave you with tonight. The open road can be a lonely, terrifying place. And Valerie's story proves that sometimes the scariest things aren't just in our heads. If her encounter in the deep woods of East Texas sent a shiver down your spine, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to Channel 19 Mysteries so you never miss a ride with us. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on what you think was looking through her window that night. So be sure to leave a comment down below. Have you ever seen something you couldn't explain while out on the road or in the dead of night? If you have any stories, creepy encounters, or unexplained phenomena of your own, I want to read them. Send your accounts over to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com, and your story might just be featured in an upcoming broadcast. Thank you for riding along with us tonight. I'm your host, Midnight Rider, reminding you to keep your doors locked, pull the curtains tight, and always stay safe out there.